Can. So today I want to go back to Super Mario and his what he can contribute to our understanding of composition, at least in terms of bringing the subject to life. So I think we all can agree that the most quote unquote naturalistic Mario, or the one that's most more real, is the one that's closer to our time period in 2021. So tell me some things that make 2021 Mario more real or lifelike than 1985 Mario. Someone says more visible features. Good. So details that bring him to life, details that you don't see in 1985 Mario, less pixels, right? And that's kind of an analogy or another way of saying like resolution, right? So more resolution means the more details, means the more kind of true to life something is. So what else do you see in the more recent foreshadowing? Yeah, so maybe even just shadows and shading is kind of what you're getting at there. His expression, like yeah, Mario 1985 has no expression because you're very limited in the number because of a few pixels. In fact, his mustache and his nostril and his eyeball seem to kind of bleed into one sort of abstract, like a submarine and something else above it. But obviously, in other versions, he has pupils, he has the whites of his eyes, and many other things come to life when you have more resolution. And of course, painting is higher resolution than mosaic. So I think it's an equivalent to 1985 mosaic, whereas painting is sort of more high resolution form of mosaic. And other things too. The shadows are a big thing I noticed. And of course, with all these details and shadows, color gradient, and other things, you can really bring Mario to life, meaning you can put him in motion. You can have him move and move in 3 dimensions. So using this kind of template, let's look at some examples today of the Virgin Mary. And you could see here, this is an interesting cross-section of, or maybe I should say an inventory of a bunch of versions of the Annunciation that we'll see in the next few weeks. And this is a bird's eye view of about 2 centuries worth of Annunciations. And you'll notice they evolve in a similar way to the way Mario evolves. In this case, though, of course, we also have to consider the background. We'll return to this in a moment. So you notice before the Black Death, before the bubonic plague, we're looking at art from 1308. Everything was still very flat and somewhat static and somewhat stiff. And then something changes and artists start pushing the boundaries, and it goes from this flat, static, stiff equivalent of Mario 1985 to what you see on the lower right. And that's Da Vinci on the lower right. In the middle is Botticelli and a few other artists who are less well known because I think the paintings aren't as well known because perhaps they're so primitive or unlike the kind of rich detail textures that you can see on the lower right. So we're going to chronicle this transition. And I really want you to remember that the Black Death, the bubonic plague, had a major impact on art and, of course, society as a whole and the church. And you might notice when you look at all of these, there is a certain point when things start getting really a lot more, the art becomes a lot richer. And I'll challenge you in a moment to think about where that is. But remember, these are all paintings that straddle the era prior to the Black Death and then after the Black Death. So on the upper left here, these are from the early 1300s. And then, of course, the Black Death happens in 1348. And so remember, that'll be a big marked transition from what comes before, which is more stiff and flat, to what comes after, which is sort of like almost alive. You see this real obsession with bringing the subject matter to life. And remember, we're veering into the Renaissance now. The word Renaissance means rebirth. And there are different ways of thinking about rebirth. In one way, you can think about rebirth as just the rebirth of civilization after the Black Death. So here's our first example. This is from 1307. And this is very much before the Black Death. This is 40 years prior to the bubonic plague arriving to Europe. So let me ask you a question. Are these subjects looking at us? And these are questions you want to ask for your homework. Are they making eye contact with us? And someone said, no, I agree. And so in this case, when the subjects aren't looking at us, you notice it's almost as if we're excluded. We're watching, but we're kind of like a fly on the wall watching what's going on, which is to say we're not necessarily meant to be part of the moment so much as a witness to what's going on. Now, if they were looking at us, it would be a very different painting, because then suddenly the picture is sort of about them acknowledging us versus us kind of just witnessing what's going on. So keep that in mind when you pick a painting for your homework. You want to make that important distinction between, are they looking at us and why does that matter? Or are they not and why does that matter? Another question is, are we above them or are we below them? This one might be a little trickier. Well, let's get back to that one in a moment. Let me ask you, how far are we from the subject? And yeah, I think about the same height. Yeah, people say, well, they're looking at each other, right, and they say about the same height. I agree with that. I think we're standing, almost meant to be standing. And a good analogy is, think about and that's, instead of this being a painting, imagine it's a photograph, right? And we're the cameraman, the camera person is holding the camera and taking a picture, and that will help you kind of understand what I mean by the distance between you and the subjects. So in this case, it feels like I'm about maybe across the room from them. So we're far enough away where we can kind of take in all the action and also see some of the context around them. And that's what really matters, that the distance corresponds to how much the artist wants you to have a sort of intimate proximity to the subject versus you seeing the subject in context in their environment. And in this case, obviously, the artist wants you to see some of the environment because clearly it's part of the story here. So someone said that we're about eye level with them, and that's good. I think that feels about right. It's hard to know for sure, or at least it's hard to know if it's within a kind of limited range, just above, just below. But if it's extremely below, then it's a little more easy to tell. Now, one thing that will help you to figure this out, though it's not easy in this case, is to find the horizon line, because when you're at eye level with something in a painting, the horizon line will cross at their eye line. And you can't really see that here because obviously there's no horizon line. And that means probably the artist hasn't quite discovered that element of the picture. And I think because in this case, they still have that golden backdrop. So they're tentatively taking steps away from that kind of mosaic approach to look us peering into like the canvas as if looking at heaven on earth, the golden backdrop corresponding to heaven, with the architecture here being like earth. So we're kind of still floating in heaven, but we have like kind of an element that is grounded, which is earth. And of course, in this case, we're looking at the Virgin Mary. Now, here's a good moment to talk about, of course, the subject matter here. The Annunciation is the moment when the Virgin Mary is told by the angel, and I can't remember exactly which angel it is. I hope the angel forgives me for that. And it's the moment when well, what do you think? What moment is this for either Christians or non-Christians out there? What moment do you think this is for the Virgin Mary, knowing what you know about the Virgin Mary? So for instance, is Jesus in the picture? And what does Annunciation mean? And I'll answer those questions for you. So, or someone says, the angel telling her, yes, she's carrying Jesus. So yes, Jesus is in fact, find out she'll give birth. Yes. So this is a very important moment in Christianity. One, because it reinforces the idea of the Immaculate Conception, that the Virgin Mary gives birth to Jesus without there being sexual intercourse, without the physical elements of sex. So a clean birth, clean pregnancy. So you're sort of visualizing the Immaculate Conception from its origin point, conception, right? And this is the moment when the angel, I think it's Gabriel, sorry if it's not, I think the angel tells the Virgin Mary, you're pregnant, right? That's a pretty big deal for any person, and also, of course, for this religion. So there are it's a tricky subject, right? I think even the title, even the idea of Immaculate Conception shows that it's tricky, because you're basically saying there's sex, there's intercourse, there's birth without sex or intercourse. And the reason why it's tricky is because sex is very taboo. And the whole premise of the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus immaculately is that you don't want her tainted by the physical aspects of sex because that kind of implies that God and the Virgin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of have to walk this very delicate balancing act between visualizing the story truly and not making the Virgin Mary seem like, or not making the subject, not suggesting anything about sex or physicality or anything. And the moment you start doing that, you kind of cross that boundary into taboo. So in this case, what do we see? Well, we see the Virgin Mary standing on her feet. What do you think her gesture, what do you feel like she's, is there an emotion that she's expressing in this moment here? You notice the angel has his fingers up kind of like this. So presumably this is the moment the angel's like, you are pregnant. But you can't have a thought bubble that says you are pregnant because people can't read. So the best approximation is to have the angel gesturing in a way that indicates that he's telling her something. And the Virgin Mary is reacting in a way that indicates she's receiving something. So it's sort of like transmitting some kind of language. But in this case, you might also consider, and this is something we'll keep talking about on Monday, is this the moment when the Virgin Mary finds out she's pregnant, or is this actually the moment of insemination? And I think probably it's the former, but I think you might consider that some artists might treat this as actually the moment when you have conception, right? So the Virgin Mary is probably holding what is like the equivalent of the Bible, right? I said I don't think there's much else she would be reading at that point. But even that goes to the real tricky thing with painting, because I think you'd agree that the idea that Virgin Mary would be reading the Bible is a little crazy because it hadn't really been written yet, right? Because this the story hasn't been told, it hasn't happened yet. So to include the Bible, or whatever it might be, I think is just a way to break the rules of metaphysics and remind you that of course she's a good pious person. And what do you want the Virgin Mary doing when she's told that she's pregnant? Well, I'll tell you what you don't want her doing. You don't want her lying in bed in the bedroom when the angel comes in and says, hey, you're pregnant, for the reasons I just went into. It would cast a shadow over the moment and really offer a little too much sexual suggestion than what this moment needs, which is to preserve the purity and the immaculateness of the Virgin Mary. So we'll use this as kind of our template, and we're 40 years before the Black Death. And so the world and the picture here feels very flat and still feels like it has one foot in mosaic. And the artist is kind of tentatively exploring the possibilities of painting with more shadows, a little more volume, um, but not really good obeyance of the laws of perspective. I think you can see that the background's a little wonky. It's almost like a folded curtain, a folded screen rather than a real building. And yet they still want to give the Virgin Mary some context because that just enriches the story all the more. So let's see some more examples so you can have some comparisons to see how one artist versus another might have tackled the same thing. So here is the Annunciation by Duccio di Buonisegna. And you notice here there's a big leap forward. Well, what changes from one year to the next? Two different artists, the same exact subject, but a little bit of changes, right? So what do you notice that's different between this one and say this one? Well, one thing you notice, the background feels a little bit more, it's not perfect. You could see these lines of perspective are all converging. And we'll learn more about perspective when we get to depth. I'm just kind of pointing out some things to keep your eye out for. To bring the background to life with more visible believability means obeying the laws of perspective. And this artist seems to have a vague awareness of that, but it's not consistent. So the background kind of is somewhat real, but still somewhat wonky. Now you notice they got rid of that gold except for the far right. So on the back, it's black, pitch black, which adds a more theatrical element to it. But still, we don't see much in the background because the artist only wants to give the Virgin Mary a little bit of context. So which room is she sitting in here? Where do you think she is in the Virgin Mary's home? Is this the library? Is this the bedroom? Is this the kitchen? Is this the study? Is this the foyer? Is this the I don't know what other rooms you have there? Uh, balcony. It looks to me like she's in some kind of like a library. It's not her bedroom. And you notice the stand with the legs, that even the three legs on the bottom are kind of flat looking. So what I'm pointing out is the artists are slowly, tentatively getting away from that flat world of mosaic and bringing the subjects to life with some volume, but doing so with varying degrees of success. The biblical stand is a little funky, but the Virgin Mary and the angel feel like they have some volume, and the ceiling feels like it's receding in space. So these are the kinds of things you want to keep your eye out for. Notice the change between the Virgin Mary and the angel here. In this case, the angel's standing, kind of walking in as if someone's kind of entered her front door and is giving her a message. Whereas in this case, there's a lot more feeling of urgency, or at least a sense of deference between the angel and the Virgin Mary. You notice angels bowing down. They both still have halos, but in this case, he's sort of delivering like a baton, like a relay race. And the Mary is definitely very like ready to receive it. In this case, she feels almost surprised and shocked, if not kind of embarrassed or awkward, kind of like she's just lowering the Bible that she was reading to make sort of to listen to this person who's just walked inside. In this case, she's kind of got her hands in the air, like she's very receptive. And so these subtle differences are really kind of all about the artist choosing to visualize their story, this story, in whatever way they think is the best way to communicate it. So the idea here is to show the main elements of the Annunciation, the angel, the Virgin Mary, put her in a certain room. You have to have them visualizing the idea of receiving a message without using language to show it, because people can't read. So the body language has to do the job of language and basically physically stating that the Virgin Mary is acknowledging the receipt of the message that she's pregnant. And depending on the artist, you might want to make her feel more shocked or more surprised or more agitated. But that really depends. And you notice we're still in 1308, so we haven't crossed that bridge into the age following the Black Death in 1348. But now notice we jump about 100 years ahead. And I don't think that's a surprise that we jump 100 years, because the last thing you're going to do while everyone's dying of the Black Death is paint a bunch of Annunciations. So it takes about, well, maybe that would be the best thing to do. If you're just sitting in your room painting Annunciations, you'll never get sick. So between 1308 and 1431, you don't get much painting. And then by around 1431, suddenly artists are, I think you notice here, firing more cylinders, proverbial cylinders, than we saw here. And you guys notice a big leap forward as far as, well, I think quite a few things visually. So when I talk about the Black Death being a big change in art, I think here is your first chance to notice that art goes from this very flat, primitive, maybe almost cartoony style to this, which still maybe has something what you might call cartoony. But what do you notice about this picture versus the one we just saw? Any changes that stand out to you guys? Here's the previous one. Here's this one. Here's this one. And here's this one. Yeah, the background is open. So now we have a background, right? So now we go from this theatrical background or even a golden background to this. And it's very clever. It's a lot of work to add the background. So maybe it gives you more work to do, but the result is all the richer, because you could see now you kind of have to triangulate between this whole new layer of visual information and what you see in the foreground. So you might consider questions that we'll keep asking, like, remember, they're not looking at you. So you don't want them to acknowledge you, because you're basically, as a viewer, you're witnessing this event. And you're meant to be, and the goal here is to bring you to this moment to witness it, right? And so in the back, you kind of have the artist cleverly combining two stories. That's actually, I think, Adam and Eve being expelled from heaven, being expelled from the Garden of Eden. And that connects all the way to Jesus. So now you're bridging visually the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you notice that's God's light shining onto the Virgin Mary. And now we have a different set of body language where the Virgin Mary is mirroring what the angel is doing. And I think this is very effective, and I think very relatable, and a really excellent choice by this artist to kind of indicate this communication between the angel and and Mary telling her she's pregnant. And I think this case kind of implies also that this might be the moment of conception, because you notice the light is now shining on the Virgin Mary. That seems to imply that this could be the moment of conception and not just the moment that the Virgin Mary finds out she's pregnant. And other people might point out the lighting. It's brighter, it's better looking. The background's open, the colors are crisper. The building feels more real instead of feeling wonky and kind of like a fold out. And even the movement feels all the more believable because the figures have volume. So we're going to keep going over some of these elements as we move forward. I'm just giving you an introduction to some of the things to look for in composition. Here you might still not totally tell if we're eye level or not, but we kind of are, and you'll see that a little better if you look at something perhaps like this, where it's a little more clear that there's kind of a horizon line somewhere there in the background. It helps a little easier, perhaps like here, you could see there is actually a horizon line. So in this case, with the horizon line, it almost implies that we're kind of above the angel and below the Virgin Mary. We're kind of in between the two, because the horizon line should crisscross the eye level of the subject in order to convey that you're at eye level with them. So the artists are playing around with this, and playing around with a bunch of other things, and you really have to put on your goggles to see them. And once you see them, you can see that, oh, they're actually making sophisticated choices. Because why would you want to put yourself at eye level with them? Well, basically to feel like maybe you're at the same level of them in the room. Now, maybe you want to put you from the perspective of a child looking up at them, and that's a clever little choice that might imply that you're like a child looking on at this moment, in which case you'd have to put us from the perspective looking up at them. And maybe there are some cases where you want to be looking down at the subject, but certainly for your homework, you want to think about, are you at eye level with them, or are you above, or are you below? And of course, usually when you're above them, that means you either have a better view, a bird's eye view, or maybe you're bigger, or maybe you're meant to be kind of floating up in the air like a drone, just getting a better view of
Oh,
context.
okay.
Whereas looking up from below means you're lower, like subservient to the subject matter. Now, you might notice this one is really where you take a big leap forward, and this is Botticelli, and now we're well into the Renaissance in 1489. So now we've gone about 150 years past the Black Death. And here you notice Botticelli, I think, is pushing a lot of buttons here, and maybe even crossing a few lines here, because the Virgin Mary is physically reacting to the news that she's pregnant. Versus, here she's kind of acknowledging the angel's body language, but here it's almost like she's recoiling. And the angel, likewise, you notice that shadow behind the angel is kind of creeping towards the Virgin Mary. And even the body language between the Virgin Mary and the angel is really close to the point of like contact. And that's why what I mean by Botticelli is pushing the boundaries here, because you really can't have the Virgin Mary portrayed in a way that implies anything physical about the Immaculate Conception, or else it isn't immaculate. So these are things that are really, I think, exceptional. Especially, you notice the halo on top of the Virgin Mary and the angel. The halo is following the rules of perspective. So it's actually, shifting in space and not just a flat disc like you see in all these previous examples. So just to have that halo in perspective as kind of part of the consistency of all the room being true to perspective. You notice the lines on the floor will converge in the background. You have a horizon line, and things are foreshortened, like smaller in the background. But of course, the physical proximity between the Virgin Mary and the angel, I think, is definitely one of those things that pushes the boundaries, perhaps to the point of breaking, rules of taboo. But what a beautiful, rich painting! You notice the transparent fabric behind the angel, and just notice how much richer and alive everything feels when you add all of these elements to painting, like shadows. And remember, I'm just introducing you to a lot of these subjects that we're going to get back to: shadows, highlights, volume, layering, gradient of color, the rules of perspective. Are they looking at you or not? Are you at eye level with them? Are you above them? Or are you below them? And of course, why does that matter? Here is a version by Da Vinci, And I think you can agree this is a lot safer, quote unquote, safer than this one, because now the Virgin Mary is public. She's out on her porch in public view. So there's no suggestion of sexual anything. She's visible. The angel is very far away from her, respectable distance. Maybe his wings are a little small to make him fly, make her fly, but that's neither here nor there. But they're outside, and it feels a lot more sort of pure because they're outside versus this one, which I think just having the Virgin Mary indoors reacting physically to the news really, I think, suggests there's more of a sexual kind of element to the Immaculate Conception than in any of the other versions we've seen here. Virgins, pun. That's, I guess, a pun. But notice in the background, we've got this very like an atmospheric perspective where things almost get blurry in the background. And very cleverly, I mean, notice the trees are silhouetted in a way that only kind of photographers would kind of understand that, in front of the light source, you need things to be really pitch black with very little details. And it's, I think, pretty incredible that Da Vinci kind of could understand light and color to the point where he added that almost photographic quality to his painting by making those trees, those silhouettes just kind of like get washed out in black and darkness. And here's a version by Raphael of the Annunciation. And I'm showing you all these different artists' version of the same subject just to show you the differences each artist might make, because we're almost like looking at different prompts by AI to show you the same subject, because each artist has the ability to make choices. And in this case, there's more of a sense of urgency, like the angels running into the room. You can see the holy dove floating down. The Virgin Mary is indoors but publicly visible, and she's devoutedly reading the Bible, sitting down. In this case, she's not really acknowledging the angel so much, and it feels more like she's maybe looking out at you in the audience. So that's one difference from the other versions we saw. But there are artists obeying the rules of perspective, and that as a result, the context feels more real. And now we're still on earth. There's no spiritual kind of golden background. So we're definitely grounded on earth. And here's a version by Michelangelo. And this is a lot more suggestive. Now it seems like we're in the bedroom. Now there's a real kind of almost interplay between the two of them, right? The male, the female. And look, she's also pregnant. It looks like she's pregnant. So, I mean, that's a pretty rapid, she's just finding out she's pregnant now. I guess she didn't ever look down. And so just having her in the bedroom at night really is a pretty I think a bold choice to make as an artist. As when we'll learn about Michelangelo, you'll see he can make choices like this. Just before we go, because we're going to run out of time, I want to show you this is a modern version of the Annunciation by Edvard Munch, and I think you'd agree this one would never be seen in a church because you'd probably get burned alive as an artist, because this is a very sexualized version of the Annunciation, where you have the Virgin Mary sleeping and this holy sperm kind of floating around, and there's fetal Jesus kind of looking up worried, wondering, oh my gosh, is this all going to lead to my crucifixion? So we're going to revisit these paintings next week, at least if not the ones we saw today, to kind of see them in their context. And I just want to give you a chance to think about some things you want to ask when you look at your homework this week. Composition: are they making eye contact with you? Are you at eye level? Are you above them? Are you below them? And what's the relationship between the foreground, the subject, and the background? And I think that's where I'm going to stop because it's about to run out. So I'll let you guys go on that point. But just make sure you do your homework over the week. And when we get to class on Monday, we'll look in depth at other paintings that show, a chance to look at composition and then depth and movement. So any questions from anyone? All right. Well, that was fast, but a good introduction to composition, and your homework will help do a little more. So I will see you guys on Monday. Have a great weekend. Bye, everybody. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a great weekend. Let me know if you have any questions about your homework.